This 4-year-old beggar girl claims she can revive a millionaire's son. And minutes later, something shocking happens. Rate my story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The scream sliced through the humid afternoon air in the historic town like a knife, echoing through the cobblestone streets at precisely 3 o'clock. The 52-year-old millionaire businessman nearly dropped his coffee cup as he stepped away from the window of his luxury apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the clapboard house across the street, a faded yellow 2-story building with peeling blue shutters that contrasted sharply with the elegance of the modern building where he lived. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, straightening his tie before returning to his work. As the owner of one of the largest construction companies in the area, he was used to solving complex problems, but he preferred to stay away from other people's dramas, especially after living alone for 5 years. Since losing his wife on a rainy night, he preferred not to remember. His wealth had grown considerably in recent years through investments in the stock market, but all the money in the world couldn't fill the void she had left. Across the street, inside the clapboard house, the 4-year-old girl huddled in the corner of the kitchen, her age insufficient to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman tightly held a metal spoon she had heated on the gas stove, her eyes red from the booze, fixed on the child who was trembling before her. "You're a curse on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the cheap whiskey she had been drinking since noon at the local dive bar. "Because of you, my sister's gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin arms. The child bit her lip to avoid screaming louder. She had learned that screams only enraged her aunt further, who had worked at City Hall until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before she went to sleep. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop whining," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you get charcoal on the walls again, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's song softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she was cooking, a popular tune about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the clapboard house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that struck a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. In the house next door to the clapboard one, the 61-year-old retired schoolteacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the businessman, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress. And that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. How strange, she thought, watching the windows of the house. She had known the family who lived there for decades. The aunt had always been problematic, but since she took custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in the historic town. The teacher dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had properly talked to the child's aunt, and maybe it was time to get to know the little girl better. The businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a kind employee who had abruptly resigned 5 years ago, a few months before the accident with his wife. She was a gentle woman, always humming while organizing the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought of her again until he heard that familiar song, echoing from a house where a child seemed to suffer in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains that surrounded the town when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the businessman closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell over the historic town, but the echo of that childish song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running away from his responsibilities, and a retired school teacher who had never been able to ignore the suffering of a child. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical hustle and bustle of the historic town, awakening for another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the clapboard house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling steps approached. The aunt opened the door with a puffy face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's drinking. "Good morning, dear," the teacher said with her gentlest smile. "I've come to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper chat." The aunt hesitated, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the aunt to step back. "And I'd really like to meet your niece. I hear she's a lovely girl." The aunt's face hardened for a moment before forcing a weak smile. She's sick, high fever, best not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Perhaps I can help," the teacher insisted. "I have experience with sick children, raised 3 myself, you know how it is." "No need." "No," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just a cold. She'll get over it soon." The teacher noticed the aunt's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her, even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while eating breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams, where the voice of a child mingled with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the clapboard house, a strange curiosity washed over him. The teacher finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not before casting an investigative glance into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the clapboard house, the aunt slammed the door shut and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the aunt growled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty, Auntie," the girl mumbled, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" the aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high fences and dominated by a single apple tree. There, she sat on the dirt and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the stove. It was always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard under the hot midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was that melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fall into place in his mind. His former employee hummed that same song while she worked. The woman who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. The employee who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named Lily, the businessman murmured, the cell phone trembling in his hands. His ex-employee's daughter was named Lily. The realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. The child who was suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the gentle woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How had he not made this connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered his ex-employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems at the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, his ex-employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt that the businessman carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped his employee when she clearly needed it. His investments in bitcoins and other ventures had yielded substantial profits in recent years, turning him into a multimillionaire, but all that wealth couldn't alleviate the weight of responsibility he now felt. At 3 o'clock precisely, the screams started again. This time, the businessman didn't turn away from the window. He watched with growing horror as, through the kitchen window of the clapboard house, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesturing violently towards a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the businessman couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? That night, the girl slept on the floor of the yard, where the aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her away from that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's death. His considerable fortune was worth nothing if he couldn't use his resources to help a child who clearly needed protection. But how to approach such a delicate situation? How to prove what was happening without putting the girl in even more danger? 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and the guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the clapboard house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting another direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the location from where she had the best view of the backyard of the clapboard house. What she saw left her horrified. The girl was sitting under the apple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing in the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "Good heavens," the teacher whispered, her hands trembling as she held onto the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined. Much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," the girl said with her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, sweetie," the teacher replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you all right?" The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. Just drawing birdies." "How lovely. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," the child replied, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Lily, where are you?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the teacher with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could see the yard partially, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him queasy. For the first time in 5 years, he felt a genuine fury burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way, even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time. She had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best Sunday dress, took a tray of homemade cookies she had prepared as a pretext, and headed again to the clapboard house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "Mrs. Henderson, I already told you it's not a good time." "Dear, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," the teacher interrupted firmly. and I insist on getting to know the little one better. As old neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the clapboard house was dark and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," the aunt lied, blocking the way to the back of the house. "That's a shame." "Maybe another time then," the teacher said. But her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and especially small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," the aunt said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The teacher smiled and nodded, but she had decided that she had already seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But dear, remember that I'm always right next door, if you need anything at all." The teacher's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the teacher left, the aunt slammed the door shut and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl huddled behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried upon hearing the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," the aunt accused, her eyes already shining with familiar fury. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," the girl protested, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt picked up the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to attract attention, don't you?" the aunt hissed as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here and ask questions. You think I don't know how to take care of you." Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone in the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. His stock dividends and his cryptocurrency profits meant nothing if he couldn't protect an innocent child. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the businessman made a call that he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend. "Bob, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child. And I think it could be a matter of life and death." That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to slip silently into the yard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the apple tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's song softly. What she didn't know was that for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering. Across the street, the businessman remained awake, planning how he would save the daughter of the woman who once worked for him. And a few houses away, the retired teacher was on the phone with the appropriate authorities, reporting her well-founded suspicions. The girl's life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine, but before salvation arrived, she would have to survive the next few days, which would prove to be the most dangerous of her young existence. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at the university almost 3 decades ago, and the lawyer knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the previous night had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," the lawyer said, sitting down in the spacious living room of the apartment. You talked about a child in danger, but I need details. The businessman poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the location that had become his obsession in recent days. The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She's being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her. Mistreated how? The lawyer asked, taking a notepad from his briefcase. Burns. Daily screams. Neglect. The businessman paused, struggling with the words. I have recordings, evidence of what's happening. The lawyer was silent for a moment, processing the information. This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately. I know, the businessman replied, running his hands over his face. But there's something else. My ex-employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before the accident with my wife. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible, the lawyer completed, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with that woman. At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and the lawyer could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. This happens every day, he asked, horrified. At 3 in the afternoon, religiously, but sometimes at other times too, the businessman replied, picking up his cell phone. Want to see the recordings? The lawyer watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a specialist in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the district attorney. That child needs to be removed from that house immediately. While the 2 men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl lived another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the girl had made on the kitchen wall during the early hours. How many times do I have to tell you not to get the walls dirty? The aunt screamed, holding the girl's arm hard enough to leave marks. You're a plague, a curse on this house. The girl tried to explain herself, to say that she had dreamed of her mother, and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. You're going to be locked in your room until I decide what to do with you, the aunt continued, pushing the child down the hallway. And if I hear even one noise, you'll experience a punishment you've never experienced before. The room where the girl was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to hum her mother's song softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was that song that the retired teacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. The teacher had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, the marks she had seen on the child's arms, the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but filled with a sadness that made the teacher's heart break. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, the teacher went directly to the downtown, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. She knew the caseworker well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. I need to talk to you about a very serious situation, the teacher said, entering the office without ceremony. The caseworker looked up from the papers she was analyzing. Mrs. Henderson, it's good to see you. What brings you here today? A child in danger. My neighbor. I'm sure she's being abused. The caseworker straightened up in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years as a caseworker, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and the teacher was not the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," the caseworker said, picking up a complaint form. While the teacher reported her observations across town, the lawyer was in a similar meeting in the district attorney's office. The district attorney listened attentively as the lawyer presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," the district attorney said, examining the videos on the lawyer's cell phone. "I will order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the home environment." "How long will this take?" the lawyer asked, worried. "With this evidence, we can act today," the district attorney replied. "I'm going to contact Child Protective Services now." Thus, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, 2 simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. The caseworker was finishing writing down the teacher's report when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services. Good afternoon. This is the district attorney. I need you to make an urgent intervention in a house on Cobblestone Street. We have evidence of severe child abuse." The caseworker paused, the pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by any chance the yellow clapboard house?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," the caseworker replied, looking at the teacher with surprise. 2 independent sources. That confirms the seriousness of the situation. At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being assembled. The caseworker, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading to the clapboard house. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. The lawyer was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," the lawyer said, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," the businessman replied, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the clapboard house. In the house, the aunt had gone out to buy alcohol at the local bar, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued to hum softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When the caseworker knocked on the door of the clapboard house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in every room. It was Mrs. Henderson who first heard the weak voice coming from the room at the back. "Someone's in here," she said, guiding the team down the hallway. When they opened the door to the room and found the girl huddled in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child looked up with big, frightened eyes, not understanding who these people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, sweetie," the caseworker said, crouching down to be at the child's level. "My name is Anne. We're here to help you." The girl looked at Mrs. Henderson, recognizing the gentle lady who had talked to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. "Auntie will be mad," she whispered. "You don't need to worry about that now," Mrs. Henderson said, reaching out to the child. "We're going to get you out of here, okay?" Across the street, the businessman watched the scene with tears in his eyes. His fortune in stocks, his investments in gold, and his holdings in mutual funds had grown exponentially in recent years, but no profit or dividend had given him the satisfaction he felt at that moment, the certainty of having used his resources and influence to save an innocent life. 6 months later, the girl was living temporarily with the retired teacher, while the legal proceedings ran their course. The aunt had been permanently removed from custody and was in treatment for alcoholism. The clapboard house remained empty, but the child's life had been completely transformed. The businessman, who initially offered financial support through his lawyer, gradually became a constant presence in the girl's life. He discovered that helping the daughter of his former employee had filled a void in his heart that not all his wealth had managed to heal. On a sunny afternoon, while the girl was playing in Mrs. Henderson's yard, painting colorful birds on real canvases now, the businessman sat down next to her. "Do you still remember the song your mother used to sing?" he asked gently. The girl smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "Yes! Do you want me to sing it for you?" As she hummed the familiar melody, the businessman realized that he had found something more valuable than any wealth: the chance to honor the memory of his employee by protecting what she loved most in the world. And so, a story that began with suffering and neglect ended with love, protection, and the promise of a brighter future for a girl who had finally found her freedom to fly. If you enjoyed this wonderful story, please comment and rate it from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. And if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.